So today we are going through an overview of how the player base in Mythic Plus has been going in this first season of The War Within, and then comparing it with the past 7 years of World of Warcraft, going back from Dragonflight, but then also back to Shadowlands, and then also even further back in BFA and even Legion, just to get an idea on how things have been going in this expansion, also because of the many changes we have been getting in The War Within, right? We have gotten the massive removal of affixes pretty much across the board. In this expansion, we have gotten the Mythic Plus Squish, where Mythic Plus 2 all the way up to Mythic Plus 9 keys have been squished into Mythic 0. We've also gotten a big change in crest acquisition midway through this season as well. So thanks to Zmiser, who has done the sacrifice of subscribing to the Patreon of Raider.io and having access to the stats feature, we can now see further back. We can now see the participation of players week by week on a weekly basis all the way back to Legion and BFA. So we can look past more than just something like this, for example, the player base comparison between Dragonflight Season 4 and The War Within Season 1. We can even go and have a much more complete picture, like for example the weekly Mythic Plus runs for the latest expansion, Dragonflight, and then the first season of The War Within. These are all of the seasons combined in one, not missing any week. We are currently on week 17. We can see The War Within is dropping low. It has gone on a pretty stable number for the past month or so. We can even see these numbers rather than looking at the actual keys being run in a normalized version. So we get to see the percentage growth or loss week by week in the 5 different seasons, and in the normalized one you can see that. Now when you look at the numbers, actually most of them are rather close to each other at this point in the season. On week 17 they are quite close in terms of player base. Now this is where you start with the list of cope asterisks when it comes to this first season of the expansion. We can start, for example, by mentioning the Mythic Plus Squish, of course. So if you have missed this or didn't even know about this, the Squish was of course the change that happened at the beginning of this expansion, where previously the dungeon difficulty was set up in a way where you had normal dungeon, heroic dungeon, Mythic 0 dungeon, and then you started your Mythic Plus from +2 onwards. In The War Within, we had the Squish, where now the normal dungeons were still normal dungeons, heroic dungeons were upgraded to be the equivalent of a Mythic 0 dungeon, and then a Mythic 0 dungeon was updated to be the equivalent of a Mythic Plus 10 dungeon. So all of the Mythic Plus keys from +2 to +9 disappeared in this expansion. Yes, of course, you can enter now Mythic Plus at a +2 level, but that is balanced and tuned to be the equivalent of a +12 of previous seasons. So obviously when you go and check and compare the play rate of these Mythic Plus keys being run in previous seasons, obviously The War Within is missing a whole chunk of easier keys that were being run in previous expansions by more casual players, or maybe alts running those low-level keys, which now are missing in The War Within. Those players might have been doing Mythic 0, they might have been doing Delves, but either way, they're not actually showing up. So that's a part of why you would be losing some players, some number of keys being run in this expansion, in this first season, compared to Dragonflight. You can see then, to try to account for this, or rather to try to eliminate this deficit that The War Within has, by making the comparison between the runs, but only at 11 plus key level. Okay, fine, if The War Within has squished the +2 to +9 because they are now part of Mythic 0, let's just look at the high level keys then, the higher level keys. So we don't take those low level casual kind of keys from previous expansions and make them inflate their numbers. That's how it looks then. You can see that The War Within is growing compared to the overall key levels. It is much closer to the two higher one, Dragonflight Season 1 and Dragonflight Season 3. We can account, if you look at this week's drop in player base, pretty much by the opening of the PTR. So having the PTR being testable, having Mythic Plus also being testable in the PTR, it might of course have taken even more players away from the current seasons in live. However, these are just the seasons from Dragonflight. It's also kind of hard to compare Season 2 Mythic Plus versus Season 1 Mythic Plus or Season 3 versus Season 1. So why not just comparing only the first seasons? So only comparing BFA and Shadowlands and Dragonflight and The War Within with their first season only. In a normalized way, looking at the percentages, drops and gains, again, up to week 16 before the opening of this season's PTR, they were reasonably close. BFA Season 1 was on the low end with The War Within Season 1, with Dragonflight and Shadowlands being on the high end. Now, what is also worth mentioning if we go back to the totals without looking at the normalized numbers is also the fact that Shadowlands and Dragonflight also had a significantly higher amount of players playing at the beginning of the expansion. As you can see from the early week 1 Mythic Plus keys being run, Shadowlands and Dragonflight were the most popular expansions. This is also, of course, another asterisk we can add. This might have been thanks to the COVID lockdown, which Dragonflight and Shadowlands both benefited from in terms of player base compared to BFA, which was before, and The War Within, which was after, which obviously suffered more. But even if you account for the larger player base of Dragonflight and Shadowlands, you can still see that in terms of normalizing the drop of Dragonflight and Shadowlands was around the 60-ish%, whereas the War Within's one was around the 70% mark. And again, we can see this gets, a little bit better when we give them the same treatment of only counting the 11 plus keys. So we're not going to see the low level keys being farmed that are not being included in the War Within's Season 1 because they are now part of Mythic 0. And you can see that now the War Within is back to doing just as, as good as average as the first seasons from both Shadowlands and the War Within. Now here, of course, you have to also have the asterisk where at the time of BFA and even Shadowlands Season 1, doing +10, +11 was actually tough. That would have been the equivalent of doing a +13 or +14 now, so it has a smaller number of players completing those keys to begin with. In fact, you can see that Shadowlands, for example, is slightly growing from the beginning of the season because more and more players are getting to that key level compared to Dragonflight and The War Within, where 10 to 11 weren't that high to begin with. Now, one of the other asterisks we might add on the player base is when you look at the orgy, that is the weekly Mythic Plus runs with all season totals. So starting from literally Legion 7.2, almost 20 seasons worth of Mythic Plus runs being run, and you can see there the orange line being the War Within Season 1. Now, one of the surprising things is that when you look at the seasons being higher than the War Within's Season 1, you can see the blue line, which is Shadowlands Season 3, you can see the yellow one, which is going to be BFA Season 4, the light yellow, whatever color that actually is, cream color is Dragonflight Season 3, and then you have Shadowlands Season 1 and Dragonflight Season 1 as being higher than the War Within. Now, as we have already mentioned, besides the higher player base, there was also the benefit of certain seasons, as you can see here from the normalized graph of seeing which seasons are going down in player base or up in player base and by how much. At some seasons, in particular, the ones from BFA, you can see that practically the top 3 seasons have been from BFA and the last one, 7.3.2 from Legion, are actually going up, right? We have now gotten so used seeing graphs like these where we expect the player base week by week during a season to go down. And then you get close to the next season, players get excited again, maybe they start running their alts through that to gear them up, and then the season launches, we have a big spike of players, and then you go down again, right? But you have a few seasons in there that are actually getting more players as the season goes by, or even staying somewhat close to their release. Even, for example, BFA Season 3, the light purple, is not losing that many players compared to the release of the season. Even the dark green one that stops because of the lack of data, being Legion 7.3, didn't even lose 20% of its players 3 months into the season. Those actually were seasons that were reviled by the players with features that have been celebrated by players for being removed from the game because they were considered, predatory, practically a mean gacha time sink minigames, like for example the grind required in Legion for your artifact power and the grind required in BFA for your Azerite power, as well as the RNG existing in Legion of Titan Forging, as well as the RNG existing in BFA of Titan Forging, and even the alternative, the experiment that Blizzard had at the end of BFA, trying to replace Titan Forging with corruptions. Now, those were seasons, of course, where you could still get your best in slot piece of gear, or even better than your best in slot, by going into a Mythic Plus key, completing the dungeon, going to the end, opening the chest, and getting a Mythic Plus piece of gear, which would have normally been a poor gear compared, for example, to Mythic Raid gear that would Titan Forge to be at the same level of a Mythic Raid piece, or maybe Titan Forge and on top of that also give you a socket or give you Leech, Avoidance, or in the last season of BFA, Titan Forge while giving you a corruption, one of your best in slot corruptions. So this made running those dungeons even deeper into the season still valuable for many players, because the potential, sort of like this meme, some players would be convinced that the Titan Forging proc or the corruption proc was just around the corner, just one more Mythic Plus and I will get my corruption, for example. And even though players were quite annoyed at that system and didn't quite like them, so much so that Blizzard started cleaning up all of these RNG predatory elements at the beginning of Shadowlands. They got rid of your artifact power, renamed Azerite power, renamed Anima power, except in Shadowlands Anima power did nothing for your character. They got rid of Titan Forging, they got rid of corruption, practically all of these RNG elements that you could grind non-stop, farm non-stop in, for example, Mythic Plus. And the result is that while players might have been happy getting those removed from the game, is that now there are much fewer incentives for you to keep running Mythic Plus deeper into these seasons. And we can see that because ever since those features have been removed, like for example all of these seasons we have just seen from Dragonflight and the one from the War Within, there is a steady drop in player base. Now the last of the asterisk we should point out is why exactly has Dragonflight Season 3, as you can see here, done this well. Usually the player base throughout an expansion goes down, right? Usually you will have your highest player base in an expansion at the beginning of Season 1. That's usually when you will get your highest amount of players. If you look at this graph of all of the seasons, you can see here that of the highest, biggest lines starting the season, you have the War Within Season 1, the orange one, then you have the green one, which is Shadowlands Season 1, you have the blue one, which is Dragonflight Season 1, and look at how far above they are compared to the other seasons. Now, the one that is somewhat an outlier, that makes no sense over there, is the cream line, which is Dragonflight Season 3. Look at that, it's practically on par with the start of an expansion level players. And right below that, the second outlier being the pink line of Dragonflight Season 2. Now that was somewhat of a cheat because of the Chinese servers. If you're not aware, right now, China has gotten their servers shut down mid-Dragonflight. What's the problem there? The problem is that Raider.io, that tracks all of this data, doesn't actually have access, doesn't have API data from basically the Chinese armory to siphon all of the runs of Chinese Mythic Plus and put them into their data. They only can see Chinese players running Mythic Plus if the players themselves upload their data to Raider.io manually. So you have a very, very, very small number of players who actually even bother to do this, usually, the very high top-level players. This meant that when these servers in China shut down throughout Season 2 and Season 3 of Dragonflight, these players went through an exodus, particularly to the Korean, but in particular the Taiwanese servers. And guess what? The Taiwanese servers were being tracked by Blizzard and tracked by Raider.io as a result. This meant that for those seasons you had a much larger number of players being actually listed when it came to the Chinese players. And then guess what happened at the beginning of the War Within? That's when China got their servers back. They got WoW opened up again, etc, etc. So all of the players went back to playing on the Chinese servers. So from Dragonflight Season 4, which is, as you see, much, much lower than Dragonflight Season 3. And then into the War Within Season 1, all of these players that were previously being counted into Raider IO basically went disappearing again. That's the reason of the sudden growth of the BFA Season 3 line, the seemingly out of nowhere. That's actually the justification for it. But after looking at all of these graphs, we can see that the overall results in this season are not particularly bad. We can go back to the weekly Mythic Plus runs normalized for this season. You can see that the War Within has kept up pretty much the same as all of Dragonflight. We can see the normalized one at 11 plus keys to exclude all of the early level keys that are missing in this season, and again this season has been doing practically average compared to the other seasons. And I think that with a smallest hint of positivity, this should be seen as a good thing, because, as again worth remembering, we don't have Mythic Plus 2 to Mythic Plus 9 early level keys being visible in these graphs, because they are now part of Mythic 0 in this expansion, and also we have gotten the Delve system. You know, no matter what, no matter how easy it might seem to many players, the Delve system has been quite popular and quite successful, even by Blizzard's standards and Blizzard's statements. So clearly there have been a whole bunch of players that might have completely ditched the experience in Mythic Plus to just play the Delve instead, meaning that you get even more players missing from these graphs because of this new activity. So when you include the Delve system stealing players away and this Mythic Plus Squish also taking away player count from these graphs, it has been doing okay. It has been not actually bad in terms of player participation. Now what you could still be worried about is the participation, still, the fact that the drop. While the player base itself has been okay, the actual drop in players has been larger than the other expansions. Admittedly, we have gone through a lot of changes in this first season of Mythic Plus. Initially, they were quite hard. It was very difficult to gear up in Mythic Plus because of the cap, the bottleneck of players not being able to clear plus 9 or 10 keys to get their gilded crests, but they needed gilded crests to become more powerful in order to clear those keys, and they were stuck there. So Blizzard had to lower the level in order for players to get their gilded crest more easily, as well as just the overall difficulty. Like, for example, the difficulty jump going from 10 to 11 into a 12 was very big at the beginning of this season. It's gonna get smoothened out even more now with Season 2 changing how hard it's gonna be to jump from an 11 to a 12. So hopefully these adjustments getting into Season 2 will make the participation keep up and stay up for longer compared to Season 1. Of course, we can still leave ourselves with the question on whether or not it could still be good and well received to reintroduce some of those previously thought of very predatory, grindy and mean kind of mechanics inside of Mythic Plus that sort of push you towards doing a certain feature in fear, basically FOMO, fear of missing out, in fear that you're getting weaker if you don't do that mechanic. Perhaps something not nearly as RNG loaded as something like Titan Forging, or as RNG loaded as something like Corruptions, but maybe something complete random example. Every piece of gear now can have 2 sockets, and you can only get sockets from shards that you loot from the end cache in Mythic Plus or from end bosses in the raid, and you have a limit of 1 socket or 2 sockets per week, so you have to run some 10 weeks something of 10 Mythic Plus keys every week if you want to keep getting your sockets on your character. Would that significantly drive the player base to complete Mythic Plus keys if they want to continue getting their sockets on their characters, for example? You would have players complaining that this is too much, that they don't have time, that this is too grindy, but then, as we have seen from BFA seasons, for example, or even Legion seasons with Titan Forging, the player base was actually higher. Player base, while complaining, they were still interacting with Mythic Plus and still getting into those dungeons to get their power. Back then it was Azerite power, it was artifact power, it was Titan Forging, it was even relics to get further weapons in Legion, but the retention in Mythic Plus was still very high despite those complaints. So maybe that could have been, since we already know it's not going to be anything like that in Season 2, but it could have been something worth thinking about, reintroducing a Mythic Plus to drive up the player retention week by week into the activity. However, that was just a thought. For now, this is what we came here to do, to just check how things have been going in Mythic Plus compared to practically 7 years worth of Mythic Plus, dating all the way back to BFA and even the second half of Legion. The TLDR is not bad, the TLDR is also not amazing, it's just completely average in terms of results so far in this first season, which I still consider positive, considering the massive amount of changes we have gotten in Mythic Plus, as well as a few features which have hurt the season in terms of play rate numbers in these type of graphs, like the delves, like the +2 to +9 Mythic Plus keys being squished into Mythic 0, lowering your numbers. With all of these things accounted for, the results so far are pretty okay. Hoping that it will improve, of course, and get better in Season 2. But for today, with this recap done, it is now time to leave each other once more. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, honestly though, I think it would work. Just put some grindy, repeatable content for player power in Mythic Plus and just see how much more is being played.